Ready, Ron?
I'm ready to roll, yep.
Today, the subcommittee meets to discuss our aircraft carrier fleet and the challenges we face in meeting presence and surge requirements and sustaining our ability to project power overseas. We thank all of our panelists for their patience in these votes. I'm sorry we're getting started just a little bit later. Because of that, all of us have agreed to basically waive our opening statements. We're going to put them in the record, and so we can get directly to Mr. Stackley's opening comments, and then we can go to questions. We have a distinguished group of panelists today that includes the Honorable Sean J. Stackley, Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisitions, Vice Admiral John C. Aquilino, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations, Plans, and Strategy. Also, Rear Admiral Michael C. Manazar, Director for Air Warfare, and Rear Admiral Thomas J. Moore, the Program Executive Officer for Aircraft Carriers. Gentlemen, thank you all for your service to our country. Thank you for being willing to be here to testify for us today, and thank you so much for your willingness to help us and guide us as a subcommittee in making sure we're doing the right thing for our national defense. With that, I'd like to look to see if Mr. Courtney has any comments. Mr. Whitman?
None.
Ms. Davis? If none, then we go directly to Mr. Stackley. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here, and we look forward to your opening remarks.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Forbes, Chairman Whitman, Ranking Member Courtney, Representative Davis, distinguished members of the Seapower and Readiness subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to appear today to address the capability provided by our nation's aircraft carriers. And with your permission, I'd like to make a brief opening statement and submit a full formal statement for the record. Sure. Before remarking on the topic of this hearing, I do want to express the gratitude on behalf of the Department of the Navy with regards to you all's heavy lifting in giving us a budget deal and your work towards the National Defense Authorization Act for 2016. Two-year deal goes a long, long way in terms of providing stability for planning, and now we'll work with the deltas between the President's budget request and the top line that we receive, but I know it's a heavy lift on everybody's part, and it's much, much appreciated. Today's Navy is a balanced force of 272 ships, near half of which is routinely underway, and of that number, from the Eastern Med to the Sea of Japan to the South Atlantic and points beyond, about 100 ships and more than 75,000 sailors and Marines are typically deployed. They are the providers of maritime security around the world. They are our first responders to crisis, in the aftermath of natural disaster to provide relief, in the face of regional turmoil to weigh against aggression, and when called into action to defeat our foe. They are our surest defense against the threat of ballistic missiles, and they are the nation's surest deterrent against the use of strategic weapons. Their effectiveness in providing stability is a product of their presence, their response time, and their ability to project power. Accordingly, in determining the requirements for building, operating, maintaining, and modernizing our Navy, as necessary to conduct the full range of military operations assigned to the naval forces, we placed a priority on forward presence, current readiness, investment in those future capabilities critical to our technical superiority, and stability in our shipbuilding plan. Against the backdrop of today's force, the Chief of Naval Operations Force Structure Assessment outlines the requirement to build to a 308-ship Navy by the post-2020 timeframe to meet our requirements against the projected threat of that day. We're on that path. Inarguably, as an instrument of American diplomacy, power projection, and global security, the centerpiece of both today's and the future naval force is the aircraft carrier. In recent years, from combat operations over the skies of Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya and Syria, to relief operations in response to natural disasters in Pakistan and Japan and the Philippines, to operations providing stability and assurance to our friends and allies around the globe, the Navy's aircraft carrier force provides the combatant commanders with a flexible, and a sustained response that can be scaled to meet the nation's needs around the globe. George Will summed it well in a recent column. The Navy's operations, on which the sun never sets, are the nation's nerve endings, connecting it with a turbulent world. Although the next president may be elected without addressing the Navy's proper size and configuration, for 4 years, he or she will be acutely aware of where the carriers are. Consistent with the 2007 National Defense Authorization Act, the 308-ship Navy outlined by the CNO's Force Structure Assessment includes a requirement for 11 aircraft carriers. With the inactivation of the USS Enterprise in 2013 and pending the delivery of Gerald R. Ford CVN-78 in 2016, the Navy is operating at a deficit with a 10-carrier force. This will effectively be the case until the Ford is ready for her first deployment, currently projected in 2021. In the interim, balancing presence and surge requirements with a 10-carrier force has become more challenging with increased combatant commander demand for carrier presence during the same period. The Navy has adjusted maintenance and operational schedules by extending carrier deployment lengths to mitigate operational impacts during this period. This increased frequency and duration of deployments, however, has resulted in increased maintenance and repair requirements back home, such that not only have deployments been extended, but so too the time required in a shipyard to make ready for the next deployment. These challenges have been further exacerbated in recent years by the budget uncertainty and impacts caused by sequestration. The net effect of operating with fewer than 11 aircraft carriers for an extended period of time is a degradation to the Navy's ability to provide the balanced presence and surge capacity. So to provide much-needed stability across the spectrum of maintenance, training, and operations, the Navy is implementing what is referred to as the Optimum Fleet Response Plan, or OFRP. In simplest terms, the OFRP targets improved planning and discipline for the conduct of maintenance and training in support of carrier and amphibious groups deployments. Adherence to the plan helps balance the tension between the demand for presence and need for surge capacity, which will be greatly relieved with the entry of Ford in the deployment cycle. The Ford, the first new design aircraft carrier since the Nimitz more than 40 years ago, will bring a significant increase in carrier capability to the fleet. 33% increase in the rate at which we launch and recover aircraft, a propulsion plant 3 times the electrical generating capacity and 25% more energy than Nimitz, increased service life allowances for power, weight, and stability to enable future modernization, increased survivability, improved combat systems, firefighting systems, weapons handling, and the basic hull design. And importantly, a $4 billion reduction per ship in total ownership cost over the ship's 50-year service life. Those members who have visited the Ford under construction fully appreciate the daunting numbers that measure her. Tens of thousands of tons of structure, thousands of miles of cable and fiber optics, hundreds of miles of pipe, thousands of compartments, hundreds of ship systems, tens of thousands of sensors integrated to drive a greater than 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plant across the globe through its life. It is a remarkable demonstration of what American industry is able to achieve, and it is a quantum increase in capability for our warfighter, capability required by our Navy in the century ahead. To be clear, the challenges associated with concurrent development, design, and construction of the advanced warfighting, aviation, and propulsion systems on 78 has resulted in cost growth and some delay. Cost growth has been was arrested early in the ship's construction, and today, with the ship's design effectively complete and production near 95% complete, we're focused on completing the test program and delivering the ship next spring. Equally important, while we confront the impacts associated with concurrency on the 78, we made essential changes to eliminate these causes for cost growth and further improve performance on CVN 79 and 80. In summary, your Navy is committed to providing the nation with the force needed to perform assigned naval missions around the world, around the clock, every day of the year. From peacetime presence to crisis response to power projection, the carrier is the backbone of that force. We're working with the Joint Staff and combatant commanders to mitigate impacts to operations and maintenance in response to current demands during this 10-carrier period, while we also work to improve performance in new construction and maintenance to restore the 11-carrier force, and with it, our ability to fully meet our presence and surge commitments. And we look forward to your questions.
Secretary, thank you for your comments. It's my understanding, Admirals, that none of you have opening statements that you wish to make at this particular point in time. I'm going to defer my questions to the end because I have a number of them. But, Mr. Secretary, if I could just ask you, you've got a very impressive team with you today. Could you just let all the 2 subcommittees know the team you've brought with you today? And then as soon as you've done that, I'm going to ask Mr. Courtney for any questions that he might have.
Yes, sir, thank you. I've referred to these as our aircraft carrier brain trust. To my far left is Rear Admiral Manazar. He is our requirements officer on the CNO staff responsible for naval aviation, both carrier force as well as aviation side of the carrier force. Rear Admiral Tom Moore is a program executive officer for carriers. He's responsible for construction and in-service complex refueling overhauls, life cycle support for our aircraft carriers. And Vice Admiral Aquilino is our head of operations for the Department of the Navy, working directly for the CNO as well as working closely with the Joint Staff.
Mr. Secretary, all three admirals have had very impressive careers, done a lot for our country, as have you, and we just appreciate their presence here today. And with that, Mr. Courtney is recognized for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses for all joining us here today. Again, Secretary Stackley, as usual, you gave a great sort of chronology and update regarding what's going on with the carrier fleet. I guess, you know, the question I think that's on a lot of people's minds is, though, that these necessary adjustments that the Navy's had to make in terms of the new maintenance program, and as well the somewhat of a delay for the Ford because of the shock trials. I mean, we actually now have parts of the world where carriers used to be that aren't there anymore, at least for some periods of time. So maybe if you could just sort of, for the record again, just kind of talk about you know, what those gaps, as the media calls it, or you know, the impact that this is having right now.
So I'm going to turn to Admiral Aquilino to address that, because he specifically has been working this issue on the Navy staff.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for the question. As you know better than anyone, the carrier force today is a centerpiece of the Navy's deterrence factor, power projection, lethality, and across the globe provides the presence needed to deter conflict, which is our primary goal. We're at a position now in time where, due to prior, what I would call overutilization, we're not at a position where we can push forward the amount of carrier presence we'd like in a sustainable, affordable manner, as well as keep in the reserve tank some surge capacity to be able to respond to crisis when needed. That's due to a number of reasons. Admiral Moore will probably talk later about the fact that we're currently at 10. 11 is the number that our force structure analysis tell us we need. Based on the fact that we're at 10, that puts us at an ability, or not at the ability we need to push what we'd like forward. Additionally, we severely overused the carrier force throughout the years 11, 12, and 13 when we maintained a 2.0 presence in the Middle East, while at the same time providing presence to the Pacific where it's also needed. And that has put us in a place where we're a little bit behind the power curve. What we're trying to do now is to reset in stride. We have to do that because very little chance to achieve a peace dividend from a force that doesn't go back into garrison. So our operate forward priorities did not give us really the opportunity to come back and reset. So the Navy is present, as you know, each and every day forward at almost the same levels that we've been operating over the past 15 years. So the plan we've developed is figure out how to provide as much presence as we can sustain and afford, while at the same time resetting to get to the CNO's stated goal of 2+3 carriers, hopefully by 2020. Those short periods where we can't provide presence it's kind of the bill we're paying now to get to that sustainable level we need.
And I think Secretary Stackley used the term balancing in terms of trying to, again, deal with what's a long overdue need, which is to get like you said, a maintenance schedule that's in stride, but also balancing, obviously, the demands that are out there. And I guess the question is, you know, you're going to be showered with demands, and you know, it's going to take discipline to sort of maintain this for the next 3 years or so. I mean, do you all feel confident that, you know, we're going to be able to get through this patch and again accomplish the goals of having a fleet that is ready to again meet all of the requirements that are out there?
So before the Secretary jumps in, we're confident that our model and our plan, sir, will get us to where we need to be, absent the fact that the world gets a vote.
Right.
So with that, sir.
I was going to punctuate his comment that it's a hypothetical in terms of what crises the nation's going to deal with, and there's going to be a continual rebalance of the risk. Today we're at 10 carriers. I think it's important to understand where are the carriers today. 4 of the carriers are in deep maintenance today. We have a carrier in RCOH, carriers in the other 3 carriers in depot that are going to be tied up in the depot for a period of time. A 5th carrier, the George Washington, is coming back to the States to enter her RCOH. So she's not available, she will not be available for surge. So you have 5 carriers then that are carrying on the operating cycle, and they're going to be rotating through their deployments. So the question that you asked regarding will we have the discipline to maintain our maintenance cycle and support, maintenance training operational cycle to get the health of the force back up, we're operating a small number of carriers, low density, high demand, and if the temperature rises in a risk area around the world, then senior leadership is going to have to decide, is it more important to do that maintenance, which is a long-term investment, or do we have to respond today to the immediate crisis? And that's going to come down to what the nature of the
And I guess that's my last question. So that, again, if the balloon goes up or there's some real, real imminent crisis that threatens our nation, I mean, there's a way that you can sort of plug things up and move carriers out if even those that are tied up back home in repairs.
From an operational standpoint, sir, I think if the balloon goes up, we will, as the most flexible, agile force out there, figure out how to get it done. That'll accept some risk from our part with regard to the levels of training of the forces that we would have to push and the timelines in which we would have to push them. But I'm pretty confident we'd be able to button some of them up, not all of them. I won't speak for my buddy next to me, the maintainer. Pretty hard to button up a carrier in RCOH. But there's others that are at certain levels where we'd be able to accelerate their getting them to sea.
So I think, part of the answer to the question is, could you do it? Yeah, you could do it once. And part of the challenge is, we have these carriers, they're designed for 50 years. Right now, we are operating them at a pace faster than they were designed. And I think not only the sustainment of the carriers, but you can see the impacts on the industrial base today. So could we do it? Sure, we could do it once. But my analogy is kind of like I couldn't run a 4-mile. I might be able to run at that pace for 100 yards. But then I'd run out of gas. And these ships right now, and you can see the impacts with the Eisenhower and some of the air carriers right now, we're consuming the service life of these ships at a pace that's faster than they're designed. And eventually, you're going to use up that service life, and then we'll be in a situation where they won't make it to 50 years. And then the domino effects from that will really cause us significant problems downstream.
Well, I want to thank all of you for your testimony and your service. Yield back.
Before we go to Congressman Whitman, can we clarify what we just said? We said we could do it. Well, tell us what do it means and what risk we have to do it, because when you're doing this deep maintenance on these carriers, I take it you don't have sailors that are sitting there doing their training and they're sitting on the carrier at that particular point in time. So what would you have to do if, as Mr. Courtney asked, you needed to send one of these carriers out? Where are you going to get the sailors and the training, and what risk is it to those sailors to go out there if they don't have that training and they're not prepared at that particular point in time?
Yes, sir. I'm glad you asked the question. As I walk through and describe, we've got 4 carriers in some level of maintenance from an RCOH up to a
And, Mr. Secretary, we know what RCOH means. Can you just,
Okay.
for the record, make sure we're clarifying that? Try to stay away from the acronyms as much as possible,
sir.
because we're
Yes,
using
sir.
this record later.
The refueling complex overhaul for a carrier once in its midlife, it's about a 44-month depot period where you open her up and refuel her, as well as do about a third of the total modernization that the ship will get in its lifetime. So it's down hard. You're not going to pull a carrier out of an RCOH. And then you have other availabilities that are not as invasive, but they do bring a carrier down, and you're not going to be able to pull the carrier right out. You're going to have to restore systems. At the same time you're restoring systems, you got to rebuild the crew, because when the carrier goes into a depot period, there's a lot of turnover of the crew, and they're not ready to go out and start operating. They've got to go through their recertifications. to ready for sea. And then a carrier comes with the air wing. You also have to integrate the air wing back on the carrier. So there's a very disciplined maintenance, training, operational cycle that we're trying to return to with the OFRP. So the carriers that we have in deep maintenance today, could we pull one or two out and make it available? Maybe, but there's a timeline that you have to deal with. So you will not get the response that we have committed to in the 2+3 regimen that the CNO has referred to, which is 2 carrier presence plus 3 surge capable within a very limited window of time, which is factored into our operational plans for major combat operations. We would be delinquent to providing that, depending on which carriers you pull out and how long it takes to button the carrier back up, get its systems operational again, and then integrate crew and air wing, get it ready to deploy.
And I don't want to be facetious, but it's not like we're just putting gas in a tank and we just have to pull the hose out and put it back in the pump and call everybody back to get on the ship. And we're talking about months of training, preparation, putting crews together, getting airplanes on. So during that month period of time, we still have huge gaps in our operational plans where we wouldn't have the carrier surge. Fair?
Yes, sir.
Good. Mr. Whitman's recognized for any questions here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks for your service to our nation. Admiral Manazar, I wanted to jump away from the ship itself to a critical element of the ship, and that is our air wings. And as we are going from 10 to 11, as we're bringing forward on, the question is, do we have the complementary aircraft to make sure that they're available so as Ford becomes available, we make sure that we have all the full complement across the spectrum of our carriers to make sure the aircraft is there. I know that we look at our F-18s, we're transitioning to the F-35. Give me your perspective on where we are with the number of necessary aircraft to make sure we have full operational capability for all of our aircraft carriers, and then where are we with number of F-18s on the deck, and then where are we with the transition from F-18 to F-35?
Yes, sir, Congressman Whitman, thank you very much for the question. You have rightly pointed out that a key relevance of our aircraft carrier is the air wing on top. As the committee knows, we retired USS Enterprise in 2012 after 51 years of service. The air wing that was on top of Enterprise in the Cuban Missile Crisis was vastly different than the air wing that was on top when we retired her in 2012. And the relevance in the fights that the conflicts that we've had is that force. To short answer your question, yes, sir, we have enough airplanes to source 11 aircraft carriers when Ford comes online. Part of my job is to build that force and to afford that force. Right now, we have a current readiness problem in our F-18Cs. And as I've testified before, because of the extension of the F-35 program to the right, we've had to sustain our F-18Cs far longer than we had planned on. Because we are sustaining them past 6,000 hours of their service life, we were running into problems with corrosion internal to the airplane that we had not seen or planned for because we hadn't planned to take them past 6,000 hours. So our near-term readiness problem is getting enough F-18Cs out to source our carrier strike groups that deploy. What we are seeing right now is we have enough to send out F-18Cs on deployment, and we are taking, well, we have less airplanes than we need in the earlier phases of our fleet response training plan. So we are taking readiness hits there. So the forces back here at home cannot train enough because they don't have enough assets. So we are in the vernacular taking risk here at home to make sure that we have deployed assets. Our F-18Es and Fs, sir, are the majority of our force going into 2035. We might even fly those airplanes close to 2040. They are relevant, very, very good airplanes. And when coupled with the F-35C coming off the carrier deck, form the most potent airplane combination of any force that's out there. And so keeping that F-18EF relevant all the way through past 2035 is key. The Navy plans to IOC, initial operational capability, the F-35C, in August of 2018. We will have enough squadrons to outfit over half of our carrier force with F-35Cs, complementing the F-18Es and Fs. We will have a predominant F-18E and F force to 2035 with a single F-35C squadron in every air wing by then. That complementary capability is going to give us the warfighting power that we need.
I know as I visited the depots where the work is going on F-18s that there's a pipeline issue there too, where we need to get more aircraft through there. Isn't there overall, though, a strike fighter shortfall, and doesn't that create a significant problem with that backup in the depots, as you said, trying to get those C aircraft out and where the demand is? And if there's a backup there, to me, it does create a problem, and there is an issue about the number of strike aircraft that we have.
Yes, sir. As we've testified, we have a strike fighter inventory management challenge because if you look at the demands on the strike fighters into 2030, we have a shortfall. I can say that shortfall in the early part of the 20s is about 138 airplanes. So we're taking measures to get the depot to be more efficient near term and then to acquire more airplanes to source that shortfall. There are two reasons for the near to midterm shortfall. The first one is the extension of F-35 has caused us to have to extend the F-18Cs from 6,000 hours to 10,000 hours. That work was, the level of work done to each airplane was unplanned in the depot. The second thing that we haven't done is procured enough airplanes to offset the amount of flying we've been doing to what Vice Admiral Aquilino talked about the use of our carriers. CNO Greenert testified a year ago that we need 2 to 3 squadrons of Super Hornets to offset the attrition loss, the hours that we've flown those airplanes. That's 24 to 36 airplanes. When you infuse 24 to 36 new airplanes into this mix, plus get the depot to be more efficient, sir, that gets a long way towards getting at that strike fighter inventory management challenge. The shortfall, if you look at supply, demand, and usage. If we also acquire enough F-35Cs starting in the latter part of this decade in this future year defense plan, you will now be able to manage to the warfighting requirement that you talked about, getting out to those 11 carriers and having the combat capability that we need. But it is a challenge we're addressing, sir, with all of our might in the naval aviation enterprise.
Mm-hmm. I understand with adding more Super Hornets and being able to make up that shortfall, regardless of how quickly we can get the depots to respond with efficiencies. But can we, and is the capability there to move the F-35C to the left to make that up? So the question is it a situation where we may need more Super Hornets because you can't get enough F-35Cs to the fleet, or is it a reality that you can do both?
So we're looking for both. My definition of the near-term problem or mid-term problem with F-18Es and Fs is if we acquire F-18Es and Fs, 16, 17, and 18, 36 airplanes, 2 to 3 squadrons, and we IOC the F-35C on time in August of 2018 with Block 3F software, that we will get at the combat capability you're talking about. Sure, we can certainly accelerate F-35 platforms to the left and buy those, but they're not the capability that the Navy wants. We specifically want 3F software. CNO Greenert testified to that, and CNO Richardson is committed that that airplane with Block 3F software is the capability that we need on our carrier flight decks to support the integrated capability we bring to the rest of our air wing. So yes, sir, we could buy airframes, but they won't be the capability that the nation needs.
I think that's the key to understand is the current capability with DNF platforms, what you'd have with the 35Cs to make sure we've got that complementary capability there. Let me ask you this in closing. You talk about making the depots more efficient. To me, there's still a pipeline issue in the aircraft that we have to move through the depots to make sure we meet demand currently, not out into 17, 18, and 19, but currently. Tell me where we are with making sure that that efficiency is going to be there, because that creates a short-term issue.
Yes, sir. This gets a little bit complex, but I'll simplify it for you. When we brought the initial bunch of airplanes into the depot, we applied a lean manufacturing model to the depot, and that means that when you bring an airplane in, you have a kit that you're going to replace parts in the airplane, and the mechanic, the artisan, takes a new part, replaces an old part, moves the airplane along. When we opened up these F-18Cs, given that we extended them past 6,000 hours, we found that there was so much corrosion in there that too much engineering work could be done. So in Stride, we have changed that process to something called critical chain process management, which is looking at the actual constraint for each airplane, assessing where that constraint lies, and then attacking the constraint. We've been underway in that process now for a year. We have already increased the depot throughput by 40%. We expect to get even greater than that, to where we have delivered somewhere on the line of 30 airplanes from the depot a year ago, and we're looking to deliver 104 airplanes a year from now. So yes, sir, we're getting our feet under us. We had to change the whole process to understand what kind of an engineering problem we have. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Sir, can I just want to add a little bit of clarification. First, Admiral Manazar described what we're doing in terms of increasing throughput at the depots. Part of that's been bringing on additional engineers and artisans. So we have, in fact, increased the hiring to help that throughput, but we've also turned to Boeing as a facility with the expertise and the tooling required. So we're looking to pull the right levers to increase that depot throughput. Today, we cannot accept the numbers that we're suffering through today. And so when Admiral Manazar talked about the projected shortfall in the 2020s, we've got to improve upon the depot part of the equation to do better than that. The other piece in terms of procurement, he described the F-35C. Just to clarify, the 2018 initial operational capability for the F-35C for the Navy, that is with 3F software. F-35Cs bought in 2016 will deliver in 2018 in the 3F configuration. And that's a software configuration. So the aircraft we're procuring will have the hardware necessary to support the software. The issue is we haven't crossed that bridge yet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Davis is recognized for any questions she might have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here and your service. Getting back to the issue of the number of air wings for the 11th carrier as it comes online, did I understand, are we still behind in terms of that last air wing?
No, ma'am. We have a model. We have 10 air wings, and we resource the 10
planning
air
for
wings.
that.
Yes, ma'am. We do a tiered readiness approach to deploying our forces. That is that as we get closer to deployment, the resourcing gets higher and higher. The way that we have had to manage our F-18C strike fighters is to take airplanes away from the earlier stages of the training, and that's what the effect has been to this depot throughput that Secretary Stackley talked about, the challenge that we've had and that I've relayed. But we can resource the number of air wings we need to deploy our carriers.
Okay, and the number and the personnel that's required as well. Is the recruitment going in such a way that we know that we're going to have the pilots when we need them?
Yes, ma'am. We've exceeded, the Chief of Naval Personnel will tell you that we are exceeding our accession goals and we are exceeding our retention goals for the force that we need across officers and enlisted. But we definitely have enough people to resource all the air wings and the carriers that we're pushing forward.
Is there anything about that still concerns you?
I think retaining our talent is always a concern. Making sure that the Navy rewards our sailors and our officers and chiefs for doing the job that they do. We can't adequately reward them because of the load, and we try to find ways to motivate them to stay. Obviously, when a new sailor comes in, we have to train them, and then that person has to get expertise in order to work for us. But so always retaining the right kind of talent, retaining that high level of talent of our young Americans is a concern. But keeping the numbers, no, ma'am, I'm not concerned about.
Because at one time we were using more bonuses. You're not doing that now.
I have to defer to the Chief of Naval Personnel on the bonus structure for retention, but I will tell you that the report to us is that we're meeting all our retention and accession statistics.
Okay, great. I wanted to just move to the fleet response time, optimized fleet response plans, and how they affect carrier availability as well. We're more or less into this first cycle, but what is it again? What concerns you the most about that? How quickly could mitigation measures be put in place if the carrier strike group maintenance gets behind schedule?
Thanks for the question, ma'am. I'll talk a little bit about the operational aspects and defer to the maintenance questions. But the key portion of the optimized fleet response plan is that it synchronizes all the things needed to produce an aligned, fully trained, ready carrier strike group, and to include the air wing, trained to execute the high-end fight when it's needed. And it's predictable to the sailors and the people who resource it. It aligns maintenance, training, supply, ordnance, and 9 aspects that we've identified required to get that strike group out on time, again, trained to the high end. So we're confident that that this will work. We've already seen aspects. We've implemented shorter portions of it to some of the strike groups, and then Eisenhower will be the first one from start to finish out the door. DePaul's in 16, comes back in 17. I think we're on a good path.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, ma'am. As far as the maintenance goes, I think it's, you know, when we put the OFRP together, we made a conscious decision to put the maintenance piece first in recognition that getting the maintenance done as scheduled and getting it done on time was a key part of the OFRP, if not the most important part. I think what we've seen here recently, as a result of being down at 10 carriers and having to run carriers at a pace that they were faster than they were designed for instance, Dwight D. Eisenhower, which just finished a 24-month availability, which was only scheduled for 14 months. She had deployed 4 times since 2008 with only 1 maintenance availability in there. So much faster than we had designed, consuming the service life of that ship much faster. So it's really no surprise, I think, that you saw some of the impacts there. We've got to get our arms around that. We certainly have spent a lot of time looking at Eisenhower to figure out where we can do better. Going into maintenance periods, we appreciate the support of the Congress in some resources to add personnel at our naval shipyards. That's certainly going to help. But going forward, you know, getting back to 11 carriers is one of the ways to get back into a maintenance cycle that will be sustainable, and then we'll support the OFRP.
Great, thank you. Secretary Sackley, you just briefly mentioned the budget deal, and is everybody breathing a little bit easier? Does that make a difference in terms of moving forward?
I think it makes a huge difference because for at least the next 2 years, the next 2 cycles, we will know what our top line is, and we'll have some certainty going into the next year. Uncertainty is a killer when it comes to planning, when it comes to execution, and you make poor decisions when you don't know what your budget top line will be and when you'll receive it. So as I described it, we didn't get the full amount of the President's budget request. We're going to work with you all, obviously, to adjust, but having some certainty for the next 2 years goes a long, long way in terms of execution.
Thank you.
Mr. Conaway, gentleman from Texas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Right, thank you. I'm on the Seapower Subcommittee because I'm landlocked. I don't have a boat. I don't have a dock. I don't have a home port. I don't have nothing. Till 2006, we tried this 2 and 3 issue with 12 carriers, and now we're trying to squeeze a square peg in a round hole with 11 carriers or 10 carriers. Can you talk to me, I don't know, Mr. Stackley or who, about did the development of the 2 deployed, 3 surge concept that predate Putin's surge? And we talked about the balloon going up. I'd rather keep the balloon from going up with the deterrence factor. So how do we deter Putin in the Atlantic and the Med, and deter China in the South China Sea, and keep something in the Persian Gulf that looks like 3 versus 2? So can you walk me through the history of the 2+3, and then how do we deter Putin and reassure our NATO allies that we're there when we need them, that when we're needed?
Sir, thanks for the question. I'll walk you through a little bit, I think, on how we view the deterrence portion, and don't have the history back to that far on the 2+3. But for the deterrence portion of your question, the cooperative strategy for the 21st century that was signed in March by the CNO, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, as well as the Commandant of the Coast Guard, takes a view of the maritime concerns that exist and how the Navy will contribute to that deterrent requirement. We are globally deployed, as you know, all the time to all the AORs. We have a forward deployed naval force in the Western Pacific, comprised of the Ronald Reagan Strike Group specifically. We currently are, George Washington's coming around. The South America just went through the Straits of Magellan, participating in UNITAS with our South American partners. We have ballistic missile defense ships forward deployed to Rota, Spain, in support of the deterrence against the Russian piece.
I know, but we're here talking about carriers. So how, is it time to relook at the 2+3, since does anybody on the panel know what the history of 2+3 is, or how we got there? Mr. Stackley?
It actually, I'm going to say it was 3+3, just shy of a decade ago.
Okay.
About the 2007 timeframe. And this, the numbers are derived from operational planning and the force that would be required to win major combat operations in the 3.0 plans.
So in that time frame, was where was Putin and his aspirations?
Well, like I say, sir, this goes back to the 2006-2007 timeframe, and
So
it's
there a
evolved
group-
over time.
Yeah, yeah. Is there a group in your team that looks, that from time to time steps back and relooks at the conventional wisdom to say, when that was done a decade ago, and we set on a 2+3, and we've held that through 2 different administrations, and now we're trying to justify that with the 11 carriers that we might have, or the 10 that we've got now, 11 we'll have in 19, 20, 21, whatever the Ford comes online. Is there a group that red teams that to say, we really, given that Putin's out there, we need 3+3 or 3+2? What is it? Is there somebody that does that?
So, yes, sir, the combatant commanders are responsible to identify the forces they need to meet the goals for deterrence, and then ultimately to be able to respond to
All right,
crisis.
so General Breedlove would tell us that he doesn't need, he would not prefer a carrier somewhere in the Atlantic or the Med?
So the combatant commanders, via our global force management process, have identified their requirements. Those get supported by the services and then allocated per the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah. No, I know you guys about hard choices. I got it. We limit your resources and try to make you squeeze all kinds of stuff out of it. But I guess I've got to ask for the record, would 12 carriers make this overall 2+3, and the maintenance and the deployments and the training and the aircraft and all the other kinds of things that you're talking about, wouldn't it be easier with 12 than 11?
Straight math, yes, sir.
Okay.
Straight math. The
gotcha.
the reality is the larger the force,
I
the more
understand the
flexibility you've
realities,
got,
sir.
and then the issue is how do you afford that?
Yeah, no, I got you.
Yes, sir.
I got you. But I do think at some point, justifying the 2+3 in today's world, because I would argue that the world is not as safe today as it was in 2006 and 2007. China wasn't doing what it was doing. Russia's not doing what it's doing. And so maybe we need a review of that whole issue to see if we're, in fact, doing our country the right way by at least saying we need that third carrier on the, out at any one point in time. So appreciate you guys being here. Great service to our country. I'm awed by the distinguished careers each of you have had. So thank you for what you've done for our country and your families, putting up with all that time being away from us. So thank them on our behalf as well. You're back.
Ms. Conway, thank you, and I know I said I was going to defer my question to them. I want to clarify a couple of questions that Ms. Conway had just to ask you. Are we going to have a gap in our carrier presence in either the Pacific Command or the Central Command this year or next year?
Yes, sir. We currently are experiencing what the CENTCOM commander would call a gap in the CENTCOM AOR.
And what he would call a gap is actually a gap, isn't it?
It is
I mean, so it's not like we're talking about terminology, syntax that's different than we won't have a carrier there. That's a gap. Fair?
Yes, sir.
And coming back to what Mr. Conaway says, has the United States Navy ever made the determination that the presence of a carrier, of an aircraft carrier strike group has a significant role in deterring a conflict from going to phase 0 to phase 3?
Yes, sir. Again, deterrence is one of the key
And it's
missions.
a significant deterrence.
I believe so.
Well, let me
I
clarify.
would go so far as to say is it's at the very core of our maritime strategy for national security.
And the reason that we can know that is because you have no single unit that is more expensive, requires more resources to deploy than a carrier strike group. Isn't that fair to say? In the national defense of this country, single unit.
I'm not putting dollars against that. I'm talking in terms of resources and capability that the carrier provides on scene.
And the reason that I'm saying that is because one of the things you guys come in to tell us always is the role we have to do in balancing what we have, the resources we have. So when you come in here and say that we need a carrier strike group, as Mr. Conway said, we need 2, and be able to surge 3. The reason we need that is because it is so vital and so important that we place one of the most important and costly resource allocations we have to try to deter that conflict from going to phase 0 to phase 3. Is that a fair statement? I see some nodding with heads, but for the record, Admiral Manazar?
Absolutely a fair statement, sir. There is no replacement for a carrier strike group in any phase of any kind of conflict.
And
there are multiple examples of when a carrier strike group was put in place to deter Cuba in 1961. 1996 through the Taiwan Strait, 2 carrier strikers were sailed through there. The deterrence factor to the United States is significant for carrier strike group. And no, sir, because of the resources the nation puts into the carrier strike group, which is not only the carrier, but the 5 destroyers, cruisers that go with it, and all the people that go into that, it's worth that deterrence factor. Yes, sir, no replacement.
And the last part of that question is, the United States Navy has also made the determination that the ability to surge 3 more carriers is incredibly important to us being able to win a conflict if that conflict were to actually go from phase 0 to phase 3. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely.
Good. With that, I'd like to recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes.
Well, if you all ever get around to building a 12th carrier, we'll take it in Everett. So I think it's Admiral Moore. We covered the 2 RCOH carriers, but we didn't cover the 3 depot maintenance carriers. And could you give us a flavor of what that schedule looks like?
Well, right now, you've got Abraham Lincoln in RCUH at Newport News Shipbuilding. You've got USS Nimitz in a 14-month availability in Bremerton. Yeah. USS Carl Vinson down in San Diego for a 6-month availability down in San Diego. You've got USS George H.W. Bush at Norfolk Naval Shipyard right now for an 8-month availability at Norfolk. And then, as the Secretary alluded, you have right now USS George Washington returning from Japan to commence her refilling overhaul in August 17. She'll go back to Norfolk in December 15. Essentially, she doesn't have enough gas off the tank to really, is a deployable asset. So you really have got those, in addition to Lincoln, you've got those 3 other carriers, plus George Washington right now that is not available to.
Yeah, and which of those are, which of those maintenance schedules are being pushed by a utilization that wasn't anticipated versus the ones that are on schedule?
Well, I think the ones, the Eisenhower is the one that we just finished, was the one that was really significantly impacted by the pace that we ran the ship. Right now, it looks like Carl Vinson's doing fine, and as is George H.W. Bush. The one up in Bremerton, the Nimitz, is probably going to be the most challenging one to us for a couple reasons. One, she's 40 years old. She's the oldest carrier ship of the class. So, and then secondly, she has had a significant period of time where we've really run her at a higher op tempo than some of the other carriers. So of the availabilities we have right now going on, I would tell you that the Nimitz one that's at Bremerton is the most challenging in terms of the size and the work package that's on.
Has that added months to its maintenance schedule over than what was anticipated?
Yes, sir. We actually, because of Nimitz, we were originally going to dock her this time. We decided to not dock her, but put her in what we call an extended maintenance availability for 14 months. And then because of the runtime of the ship, we're going to deploy her, but we're going to bring her right back and put her back into a docking availability. So she is going to have, in the span of about 3 years, a significant amount of maintenance done on her to try and catch her back up, if you will.
And she's due for decommissioning.
2025 is when she inactivates. Yes, sir. That's when she'll hit 50 years.
Any of this driven by I think Readiness Subcommittee had a hearing where Admiral Harley testified that the Ford was going to be delayed 2 years, even though it's being delivered in 16 and goes to work in 18. There's a little delay there.
Well, there's no doubt that being at 10 carriers, which is exacerbated by the fact that the Ford won't be now deployable till 21. The law says have to be 11 carriers, but it's only measured by when we commission Ford, and we'll commission Ford next summer. But the reality of it is, she's not a deployable asset now because of the way we're going to go test her until 2021. So we'll be in a period of 10 carriers here to about 2021. And back to my initial comments, when we inactivated Enterprise in 2012, that took us down to 10. And then in the last 3 years, in order to meet the demand signal of COCOMs and meet the presence surge requirements, we've run carriers harder than we had typically done it, and harder than they were designed. We've had, since 2012, we've had 7 aircraft carriers that have gone more than 300 days of deployed time between maintenance availabilities. Not all of it consecutive sometimes, but a lot of time, and that's an awful lot of run time, and that's a challenge that we're going to have to continue to face here until we get Ford on the line.
Yeah. Admiral Manazur, could you comment, I think I know the answer to this, but you probably would know it with regards to the 18Gs. Do we anticipate those being, do we anticipate the Navy's 18Gs being the only air-based electronic attack? Are they going to have the national mission and the expeditionary as well as being carrier-based, or is that what the Navy's anticipating, basically serving the other services?
Yes, sir. So a couple things in your question. The E-18G Growler is the only Department of Defense airborne electronic attack platform will be in service once the last of the Prowlers decommissions. The United States Navy has bought 153 Growlers. Thank you very much for the partnership there. We are completing a study to see if that is enough Growlers for all of the missions that the Joint Force would carry out.
Right. Good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate hearing about the importance of the growlers made in Missouri, and we certainly are trying to be supportive of making sure that you all have the assets that you need in that regard, so continue to work with us on that. I wanted to clarify about the USS Gerald Ford, because at the subcommittee hearing that we had earlier, it said it was scheduled to be commissioned in the early half of 2016, but then due to the shock trials, it would be delayed an additional 2 years. So that would be 2018, but then you're saying now it'll be 2021 before it is commissioned?
Yes, ma'am. If I could, just to clarify, we'll deliver the ship and commission it next summer in 2016, and because it's the first ship of the class, it'll have a series of initial operational tests and evaluation that we would have already done, and that would have stretched out for several years to go prove that the ship does what we contracted the shipbuilder to do. So she was originally scheduled to deploy, her first deployment would have been in 2019. And now, because of the shock trial, we will now deploy her for the first time in 2021. So that's the delay I was referring to.
And I know that they said in August 2015 is when they wanted to have that shock trial, and I know it's only been a few months, but have we had any development on that? Have they arrived at that point yet to do any of those? Or?
Yeah, we'll shock her in summer 19, August of 2019, and we're making preparations to go do that now. We'll bring her out of the yard. We'll shake her down in our parlance to make sure you kick the tires and make sure that you're getting what the taxpayers said that we were buying, and then we'll go out and test her through a series of things for this brand new ship, and then we'll go ahead and set her up and do a shock trial in the summer of 19.
Okay. Well, it is concerning that it'll be another 6 years, basically, if I figure right, before we get to 11 full carriers again. And so hopefully we won't need them, and the world stage will allow us to have that, only 10. But I wanted to talk more, and several people have already mentioned, but the maintenance situation. Of course, we had almost a 2-year maintenance on the Eisenhower, after you've already talked about the extended service that it had that resulted in that. But has there been any lessons learned by these extended deployments to maintenance needs that perhaps you can bring to the Gerald Ford in redesigning or to help decrease the amount of maintenance that's needed on the newer models?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, we spent an awful lot of time in the design of the ship trying to figure out how you could spend less time in maintenance and set the ship up so that it would require less maintenance. So a couple of things. One, the Ford is designed to only have to dry dock the ship every 12 years. We dry dock a Nimitz-class carrier today every 8 years. So over the life of the ship, that's 2 fewer dockings. That means more time available to the combatant commander. We used a lot of specialized materials on the ship that don't corrode as much. So a large portion of the maintenance we do on the carriers today involves opening up tanks, going in and blasting, coating, and painting those. That spends an awful lot of time. The other thing that we did that I could point out to you is a large portion of the Ford class, the interior of the ship, is air conditioned. And while that may seem like a great thing, and you say, hey, it's nice you're doing that for the crew, actually the reason we've done that is because one of the largest sources of corrosion and maintenance that we do on the ship is the ingestion of salt air from the environment that we work in. And so we spent an awful lot of time redesigning the Ford to air condition large portions of the ship. For instance, this is the first aircraft carrier that we've ever had that we will actually air condition the propulsion spaces. And the combination of that and then a redesign of the ship, which has resulted in there's half the number of valves on board. We took the steam systems, which generate hot water on a Nimitz-class carrier. They're electric now, so we don't have steam piping running throughout the ship. So we've tried to go back and take all the lessons learned off the Nimitz-class, a very manpower-intensive ship, great class of ship, and roll those into the Ford. So I think when you see the Ford get out there, we've projected we'll spend significantly less time in depot, which means the ship's available to the combatant commander, and we'll spend 20% less on maintenance dollars. The last thing is this class of ship is designed to only go into a depot availability every 43 months as compared to a Nimitz-class carrier, which is right now at 36. So we won't put it in maintenance as much. When we put it in for maintenance, we'll do less maintenance.
That's good to hear. Thank you very much.
Yes,
for your
ma'am.
service. Yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In looking at how the carrier fleet may be updated, there is a greater focus on the use of automated systems to alleviate costs. What plans does the Navy have in terms of extending ship life and freeing up resources for other uses?
Let me start with the ship life itself. It is a 50-year service life on the aircraft carrier, and today the ship is not designed for a service life beyond 50 years. What we're trying to do is drive down the cost of getting it to 50 years. So the automation that you described, that's a critical component of that strategy, because a big part of your cost in service life is the cost of people. And so to drive down the size of the crew on an aircraft carrier, we've converted to first reducing the maintenance load that the crew has to perform, but also relying on automation, where a sailor in the past might have taken a particular action. Now we're using automation to relieve that burden from the crew. So in total, in terms of the ship's force itself, 600 sailors come off of the comparable number that puts a Nimitz-class carrier to sea, largely thanks to the automation that we've embedded into the systems. So that's the life cycle cost savings. And then, as Admiral Moore described, the efforts to improve reliability and reduce maintenance loads makes the carrier more available to get underway in its 50-year service life. Going beyond 50 years, that would entail another refueling cycle for the aircraft carrier. And our experience to date is at that stage of the hull's life, you're better proceeding with replacing the hull with a new ship than to try to refuel a 50-year-old hull to get another 25 years out of it.
Thank you. As our carriers operate within the carrier strike group, how do we stand as far as supporting vessels and resources that the Navy needs to ensure that every carrier group is properly supported?
Sir, the Military Sealift Command is the supporting assets to meet our carrier strike group logistics requirements. They are currently structured to meet the force structure size of 11 carriers, and they're sized rightly to do that. They forward position in some cases, they deploy with them in other cases, but currently we are matching the need with the requirement.
I would simply add, I described in my opening remarks the force structure assessment that was completed by the CNO in 2012 and updated each year since. That outlines a very balanced force. So while the 11 carrier force is the centerpiece, it also includes all the escort ships that are part of the carrier strike group and support ships associated with replenishing supplies on the carrier and to support not just the carrier but also the ships that would accompany her on deployment. And so then if you look at our shipbuilding plan going forward, you'll see each type of ship that's outlined in that force structure assessment, its procurement plan to either build new or to extend its service life to ensure that we have the full complement described.
Sir, and if I can add, the force structure assessment that Secretary Stackley is describing, to go back to a question that was asked by, I believe, a gentleman from Texas, this force structure assessment is sized for a United States Navy force that conduct a complex multi-phase campaign against a high-end adversary in one region and be able to deter or impose costs on an adversary in another region. This force is designed to do that all the way to 2030 is our assessment.
Thank you. In your opinion, does it make more sense to, well, let me ask the question this way. With respect to the sustainment phase of ship construction, how would the requested funding be allocated to sustain the carrier force as it is?
Well, I think what you're describing there, sir, is our funding in the President's budget request. We have new construction funding, which is ships conversion and Navy, SCN, but inside of our operations and maintenance account is the maintenance funding required to support the carriers in their service life. So we talked earlier about the optimum fleet response plan. That lays out the cycle by carrier strike group for ships entering the maintenance window between deployments. And then the budget request that comes over annually provides the funding for the stack of ships that would be in depot maintenance, as well as routine maintenance to execute the requirements consistent with the OFRP. And that's done by ship type in terms of both maintenance and modernization for the specific windows.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panelists for your testimony today and for your service and for your family's service to our nation. I'm proud to represent Fort Drum, home of the 10th Mountain Division, and as you know, currently brigades are forward deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq and have been since September 11, 2001. And recently, I was fortunate to embark on the USS Truman while she was underway, and I also accompanied Chairman Whitman on a visit to the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center at NAS Fallon in order to view the entire workup and training cycle prior to deployment. And these visits, both of them made it very clear the significant role the Navy has in providing close air support to troops on the ground. And recently, there has been discussion about how our air wings may require some adjustments in order for the carrier strike group to be successful in the high-end fight against competitors like China. But as our Navy considers how to meet these challenges from the high-end threat, I also hope that the capabilities are maintained so that the carrier air wing can continue the support of troops on the ground, like the 10th Mountain Division soldiers that I represent. So can you please explain to me how you plan to maintain or improve the carrier air wing's current close air support capabilities while simultaneously preparing for a high-end fight against a peer competitor?
So, ma'am, that's my job as the Director of Air Warfare. I will tell you that the F-18Es and Fs that are over the top of our troops in northern Iraq, in Syria, and in Afghanistan, supporting those troops for a decade, are the same fighters that we will have through 2035. And coupled with the Joint Strike Fighter F-35C, which has significant close air support capabilities, you will still have the close air support capabilities that we've enjoyed for the last 15 years in these fights in different AORs. Those same aircraft, F-18Es and Fs and F-35Cs, are capable of operating in the high end, particularly when coupled with the E-18G Growler. So the air wing that you see on the flight decks now, augmented by the F-35C in August of 2018, will continue to be able to operate across all the phases of warfare, whether it is close air support or whether it's a high-end fight against an anti-access area denial type of adversary.
Great, thank you, Admiral. Any other comments?
No, ma'am, other than we are completely integrated with the Army team on the ground. We've made numerous operational changes. At my last deployment, I had 3 Army LNOs who rode the ship with us in direct communications with the troops on the ground in order for the pilots who were about to take off, had the latest and greatest update on the situation on the ground so they could best support them. It is the most important thing we do, and we take it very seriously. Admiral Manazar is putting together a great list of equipment so that we're synchronized, aligned, and interoperable with our Army and Marine Corps team that's on the ground.
Great. I know I speak for the 10th Mountain Soldiers I represent that we are appreciative of that support, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank all of the great service members that are testifying today. I'm a Navy pilot by trade. I recently traded in my wings of gold for wings of silver, but I still, at heart, am a Navy pilot. I joined my fleet at a perfect time. I joined VAW 113, the world-famous Black Eagles. And when I joined the squadron, we were in the middle of what was called, at the time, an inter-deployment training cycle, IDTC. So I had the opportunity, as a brand new guy coming out of the FRS, had an opportunity to see the whole IDTC work through. I got to participate in the Strike Fighter Advanced Readiness Program. I got to participate in JTFX, Air Wing Fallon, Comp 2X. I eventually, after I finished my sea tour, I went in and worked at the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center. But what was interesting is it was an 18-month cycle followed by 6-month deployment. And then we had the wars in Afghanistan start and the war in Iraq start. And what was the IDTC ended up being, instead of a 6-month deployment, a 10-month deployment. And at that point, it seemed like the inter-deployment training cycle pretty much went off the rails, and they started new programs, Fleet Response Plan, and now the Optimized Fleet Response Plan. And even with these plans to get more out of less, still gaps are emerging that are, in my estimation, dangerous. And one of the questions I have is, have you guys done a detailed analysis as to what the impacts would be for the training cycle if instead of 11 carriers we had 12? And I know other members have asked this question, but what would be specifically the impacts? I know that 12 is better than 11, we heard that. But what would it do, for example, for the IDTC, which of course has a different name these days? What would it do for the men and women who serve? Would they get to maybe not deploy as frequently? Would the deployments be 6 months instead of 10 months? Would there be fewer gaps, for example, in the Persian Gulf or in the Mediterranean? Would there be more time for us to stay at home training and maintaining not only the ships but also the aircraft? So all of these kind of things that go into determining what is the right force structure and do we need 11 or 12, can we get specific analysis as to what are the impacts? What is the difference in the fleet if we have 12 instead of 11?
Sir, I'll hold off on the analysis piece, but I will get to your discussion on the training cycle. So the Optimized Fleet Response Plan is targeted to do what you highlighted as somewhat of a frustration. In that plan, the key segments of the design, the ship must get in on time for maintenance, it must get out on time. That preserves 120 plus days of basic training for the ships and the pilots to do the SFARPs and things you described. It also carves out an integrated / advanced timeline of 120 some odd days to do the COM2Xs and the JTFXs. And it preserves that ability to do the high-end training that previously I think we've seen was the shock absorber for when you either had to deploy early or when the ship came out of maintenance late. We're fencing that, understanding that the only way to train to the high end is to preserve that time and then have discipline in the process. That is a critical part of OFRP.
So if that time is preserved, how are you stretching? Are you getting more, like when you deploy, or the deployments are longer? Is that the goal?
We've done longer deployments in the past, but the tenet of OFRP that the CNO needed to get to, based on a couple of questions before, was a commitment to a 7-month deployment. That is for the crews and families, so that, number one, it's predictable. Number two, it doesn't impact on future retention problems later, because as you know, 1 day is okay, 6 months pretty challenging, 10 months is really hard. And I think the CNO wants to get away, we need to put that predictability back in. So the commitment to 7 months as a part of our force generation model is critical.
When you say commitment to 7 months, meaning not to go past 7 months or do at least 7 months?
7 months is the targeted goal for a carrier strike group deployment. That's what we are bringing into the global force management process. That is the number that we use to generate the presence needed or presence provided under a supply-based model that we're using today.
Okay. Can we get, I'm down to my last second here, can we get maybe for the record what that analysis would look like for those items I mentioned regarding a 12 carrier fleet, vice an 11 carrier fleet?
Sir, at risk of not answering your question, but telling you, we referred to a force structure assessment that was delivered by the Navy to the Congress in February of this year. That force structure assessment looked from now until 2030 using the optimized fleet response plan and looking at the projected threat capabilities, and that assessment came down and said 11 is the minimum number we need with an acceptable level of risk.
Does that mean gap? When you say acceptable,
well, sir, the gap part is different. That's the global employment of the force. That's the global force management model gap. But the 11 is the minimum force we need from a capability perspective. Where as Vice Admiral Aquilino testified to, a different process is used as where to put that force. But the force structure assessment was submitted by the Chief of Naval Operations to say that 11 is the number if you look across our force. So that, sir, was the analysis that was submitted to Congress in February of this year.
So there is no analysis as to what would the impact be if you had 11? I'm just asking. I mean, that nobody looked into that?
From what perspective, sir? So if you're talking about where we would put the forces.
From a gap analysis, would it reduce gaps? Would it allow service members to spend more time at home to do training and to do maintenance, and ultimately?
Let me take that, sir. Sure. No, we have not done an analysis for a 12 carrier force since the JFK retired 2006 timeframe.
Okay.
To conduct that analysis, in other words, to take the force structure assessment that we have done and say, what if we were a 12 carrier Navy? That would be not just adding a carrier, obviously. That would be adding all the elements associated with the carrier strike group,
right, as
well as the sailors that would be added to the deployment cycle, which is not a one-for-one. So that would be a very comprehensive assessment. Today, what we do is, as Admiral Aquilino described, is we're a supply side equation today, where we know the force that we've got. We take a look at the peacetime presence demands, and we take a look at major combat operations, and we see, can we supply the amount of force necessary to satisfy both? Clearly, there is higher demand from the combatant commanders today than we can provide in an 11 carrier force. So there is a prioritization that takes place inside the joint staff in terms of the gift map. For major combat operations, the 11 carrier force to provide the 2+3 surge carrier strike groups, we believe is what's necessary to meet our requirements. Would a 12th carrier strike group relieve some of the burden to the total force in terms of operational cycles? Yes, it would. Do we know what that would entail in terms of the total force structure, including sailors, and how that would ripple through the the optimized fleet response plan? We have not done that analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Let me say to you, gentlemen, thank you for being here. Just a couple of wrap-up questions that I deferred from the beginning. The role of our two subcommittees that we have chosen to take today is not to point blame at Republicans or Democrats, the administration or Congress, not to point blame at the cuts of $780 billion versus sequestration, but it's to assess risk and to see how we, and threats, and see how we can fill those gaps. As I listened, Admiral Moore, to some of your speeches, which I appreciate and look at, you had a phrase that I have copied, and sometimes I give you credit for it, and sometimes I don't. But it is that we are an 11-carrier Navy in a 15-carrier world, and you probably said it more articulately even than that, but it sums up the fact that based on what Mr. Conway was talking about, all those risks, we probably need 15 aircraft carriers as opposed to 11. Admiral Manazar, in all of your analysis, you've told me privately and not with any analytical backing behind it. But if we could ask you guys to go in another room, and we brought our combatant commanders here, the guys who look every day into the risk that Congressman Conaway talked about, that growing risk of Russia, China, everything else in the world, they may say we need 21 aircraft carriers, but certainly more than what we have. Regardless of what Admiral Moore would say that we might need in the world, or Admiral Manazar, what we may have from our combatant commanders, the reality is that the United States Congress and the United States Navy have basically agreed we need 11 aircraft carriers, and we have less than that today. The United States Navy has also, I think based on your testimony, concluded that the mere presence of one of those carrier strike groups has a significant role in stopping a conflict from going to phase 0 to phase 3. Therefore, not having that carrier creates a huge vulnerability that we cannot stop that escalation from taking place. So I ask any of you if you can tell us the size gap that we will have over the next 12 months in either the Pacific Command or Central Command, where we will not have a carrier strike group present.
Yes, sir. There are, in the next year, some periods similar to what we're seeing in the CENTCOM AOR now. Again, the reason is, number one, not because we don't want to. The number
This is not fault.
Copy.
This, all we need is, and we've already established we have the gap. How large is the gap? We have heard that in non-classified statements. Can you tell me how many days that gap will be present in the next 12 months?
I would prefer to tell you that offline, if that's okay, for classification purposes.
Okay, that would be fine. How about CENTCOM? Can you tell us what's going on there right now that's not a classified?
Currently, as been reported, there is a gap in the CENTCOM AOR.
So no, and when we mean gap, just so we know, when we look terminology, we mean no carrier strike group.
Yes, sir. That's the word gap.
And the other thing that we can agree upon that I think the United States Navy has concluded and made a judgment of, and the CNO has said, is that if we do not have that capability of having 3 carrier strike groups for the surge, which means we can bring them to the fight if we're not successful in keeping it from going from 0 to phase 3, that has a huge impact on whether or not we can win or lose that conflict. Is that fair to say?
Yes, sir. Those follow-on assets that would be needed for many of the crises that are potential, they're critical to being able to win the fight, absolutely.
And if they are critical to winning the fight, and we need 3 of those strikes to supplement the 2 that we don't always have right now, give me an idea of the time frame that I would be looking at over the next 12 months. And let me use my friend Mr. Courtney's phrase, if the balloon goes up, and maybe I would rephrase it, if we had a conflict that went from 0 to 3. How long would it take to mobilize those 3 carrier groups and to send them on their way to that fight?
If you don't mind, sir, I'd prefer to give you those numbers offline as well for...
Be fair to say there would be a significant amount of time.
Yes, sir, and definition of significant...
I understand.
We can talk.
Now, the last thing that I'd like to put on that equation, too, is we know we will have times when we will not have a carrier strike group in the Pacific Command or the Central Command. That has a huge impact on whether we can deter a fight from going from phase 0 to phase 3. That in addition to that, we would have what we would conclude to be a significant time period, regardless of what significant means, and when we could mobilize the 3 carrier strike groups we would need to surge, therefore having an enormous detrimental impact on whether we could win or lose that conflict. When we talk about even if we win or lose, that time delay, can you tell me whether or not that could also equate to putting at significant risk the lives of men and women who would be in that fight?
Absolutely, sir. So A part of the planning that goes on absolutely is identified by the amount of time your forces can respond. The delay to the response of those forces absolutely increases the risk, the timelines you're on, and ultimately gets to personal risk.
Okay. And Admiral, you have looked at our military objectives. Can we accomplish all of our military objectives with our current aircraft carrier presence and surge posture?
Sir, the 11 carrier force that is identified as needed, absolutely.
No, that's not my, I understand you do it with that. I'm talking about today, with what we have today and the world we're living in today and the environment you have. Can you accomplish it with what you have?
I would say we're accomplishing it, the requirements at increased stress to the force and the ability to get to a sustainable posture that allows us to carry a Navy into the future to meet those same requirements over the long term.
Okay. And one last...
Sir, I would just add to that, and I think it's in black and white in terms of the force structure assessment that the CNO outlined. We require 11 aircraft carriers to meet our full range of military operational requirements. Today we're at 10, and we're at 10 that are highly stressed because they have been driven hard, and so we have more carriers in depot maintenance today than we would normally have under a more stable operational cycle with an 11 carrier force. So we have the compounding impact of we're down a carrier and then driving the remaining carriers harder. We have more carriers in depot maintenance, so we have a shortfall in terms of our ability to generate the carriers with their air wings in response to crisis today. And until we get the Ford ready for deployment and we're back up to 11 carriers and the optimized fleet response plan catches hold in terms of restoring our operational and maintenance cycle to where it needs to be, until we get back into that state, we are going to be operating at a deficit.
And Ms. Secretary, we're here to help you. We're just trying to define what that risk is so we can make sure we shore it up. I do have one last question for you. The Navy has proposed a two-phased acquisition strategy for the construction of the USS John F. Kennedy, CVN-79. I understand that first phase would construct the hull and superstructure of the ship, and the second phase would insert the combat systems. Has the Navy ever performed a two-phase aircraft carrier strategy, and is such a strategy contemplated for CVN-80? And can you tell us the reason why we are adopting that phase?
Yes, sir. Let me, the first question regarding whether the Navy has done this before on a carrier, I'd have to go back and research whether we've done it with a carrier, but we have done that with surface combatants in the past, where the shipbuilder would build the ship, and then at a naval shipyard we would install the combat system. Today, in fact, on the DDG-1000 program, we're doing exactly that as well. And I'd have to do research in terms of whether we've done it on a carrier. The motivation for doing this, the CVN-79 is the numerical relief for the Nimitz, which retires in 2025. At one point in planning, the Navy was looking at the construction schedule for the CVN-79 to support a heel-to-toe replacement of the Nimitz. That is not an optimal construction schedule for the shipbuilder. So there is this tension between we wanted to build the ship earlier to reduce cost of construction, but she's not required until Nimitz gets ready to retire. So do we ramp up a crew, have a ship operational for a period of time in advance of when she's needed? So those were the trades that we're looking at from a schedule perspective. Separately, we're looking at how can we reduce the cost of the CVN-78 class through its construction. And a couple things jump out. One is there is work that is better tailored, better suited for being accomplished outside of the new construction yard where third parties could bid on it competitively. Two, we have this long history of a very long construction cycle for the carrier. Systems that you identify early on in the procurement process, particularly electronic systems, command, control, communication systems that are subject to obsolescence. By the time the ship is built and it's outfitted and delivered, those systems are already obsolete compared to the rest of the Navy. So we look for an opportunity to install those systems as late as possible And then the third piece is a very specific system, which is the radar for the CVN-79 and follow. We are, in fact, developing a new radar for our carriers and big deck amphibs, the Enterprise Air Surveillance Radar. That would not be available to install inline in construction on the CVN-79, but it is available to install in this second phase. So we looked at, let's optimize the construction schedule, which means building it earlier, but then let's assign the manning more in line with the replacement of the Nimitz. So that created this bifurcation in terms of the schedule. And then in this phase 2 window, we'll install the C4I equipment, the electronics equipment, we'll install the new radar, and then we'll complete some of this work that would be competed, frankly, with third parties and be able to be done pier side. It seems to be the right balance. It is unique to CVN-79 because of the schedule window that we have to do this. We will not have this opportunity on CVN-80 because her schedule, her construction schedule is going to be pressed up against. She will be the numerical relief for the CVN-79.
So we don't have plans to use it on CVN-80?
No, sir.
Good.
No, sir.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for being here today. As you know, each day we come into this rather impressive committee room. I look at all the things I worry about in the world and the things I'm grateful for. One of the things I'm grateful for is that we have talented people with the kind of commitment that you have to making sure you're defending and protecting this country. So we thank you for that. Also, I have told you at the beginning that we wanted to give you any time that you needed to elaborate on something perhaps that we didn't discuss you felt was important for the record, or to clarify something that you'd like to clarify. So at that time, I'd love to do that. And Mr. Secretary, we'll let you start.
Sir, I gave an opening statement. I've had plenty of time to discuss the issues and questions and answers, and I defer to my colleagues here.
Okay.
Sir, I'm trying not to get quoted by you as Admiral Timur did, just so you know.
So look, I'm praising him. Yeah, we'd love to have another quote like that.
What I will leave you with, sir, just so you're aware, you know better than anyone, your Navy is forward deployed each and every day doing the things that are needed. So I thought, based on the carrier hearing, I'd tell you where your current up to last, or we talked about where the 5 parked ones are. Let me tell you where the 5 working ones are. So Theodore Roosevelt just coming back from a greater than 8-month deployment that was in the North Arabian Gulf in support of the fight against Syria and ISIL. On the way home, they went and participated with Operation Malabar with the Indian Navy. They also participated with the Japanese Navy as a part of that as well. Ronald Reagan, now deployed as the forward deployed naval force carrier, coming out of Korea, doing operations in the Western Pacific. They'll participate in an operation called Annual X with the Japanese, pretty critical to our allies and partners to stay plugged in and interoperable. George Washington, we talked about, while she's coming around to go into overhaul, she's executing Operation Unitas on both the west side and the east side of South America, working with our partners down there across the globe. John C. Stennis on the West Coast and Harry S. Truman on the East Coast, both are almost complete with their workups. They will be deploying shortly as the follow-on replacements. And, sir, I know I don't have to tell you that, but I figured you'd want to hear that. Still working hard each and every day. Thank you for your time and appreciate it.
Thank you, Admiral. And Admiral Moore, we would love to have another great statement.
I'll try and avoid that today, sir, if I could. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time today. It's one of the great honors of my career to have the opportunity to design and build and maintain our nation's aircraft carriers. We didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the Ford class today. Despite some of the challenges we've had with Ford, we're going to deliver her next year. We're on a sustainable path going forward. That is going to be a great ship, built by some fantastic shipbuilders down at Newport News, which are national assets. I did spend a lot of time talking about the Nimitz class and our need to maintain that ship for 50 years. And spent an awful lot of time talking about the industrial base. What I failed to mention is one of the things that we also should be worried about. I think the industrial base, no matter how hard we can run these ships, we'll be able to maintain the ship. One thing I failed to mention, I should have, is the other thing is we are also running the sailors and the men on those and women on those ships extremely hard. And I have no doubt that the industrial base can put those ships back together, but I do worry about the pace that we're maintaining for our sailors. And so I'd just like to add that for the record and point out again why it's so important for us to get back to 11 carriers.
Thank you, Admiral. Admiral Manazza, we're going to let you do cleanup.
Mr. Chairman, usually I'm not shy as a fighter pilot, but I'll try also not to make declarative statements beyond what you've already discussed with us today, and I thank you for the opportunity. I'd like to clarify one point and then give some closing comments. Chairman Whitman, when you and I discussed Super Hornets and F-35Cs, what I need to clarify is while we buy both of those, the impact of the F-18EF is most impactful 16, 17, 18. The airplanes we're procuring now in that combat capability, of course, go together, and as Secretary Stackley said, the F-35Cs that we're procuring in 16 to deliver in 18 is the capability impact. So I hope that that's a little more clear. Sir, thank you very much, and Chairman Forbes, Ranking Member Courtney, thank you, members of the committees today, for the opportunity to join you and for the personal investment so many of you have made in ensuring Navy's ability to defend the nation, to protect American interests at sea, and specifically for your ongoing support of our nation's aircraft carriers. As your Director of Air Warfare, this is what I worry about, lose sleep at night about. But your bipartisan support, your visits to our carriers both underway and while they're being built and maintained, the assistance you and your fellow members provide truly make a difference. Adaptations and improvements to our carrier strike group capabilities continue, and they include, most recently, USS Eisenhower recently completing a highly successful series of developmental tests for the F-35C, called Developmental Test Period 2. That's our 5th-generation strike fighter that will ensure the Navy's aircraft carriers deliver air dominance in that high-end warfight. The E-2D Advanced Hawkeye was deployed on the Theodore Roosevelt for the first time to bring superior long-range battle management, command and control, with sensors that support offense and defense for the entire carrier strike group. The continued delivery of the carrier-based E-18G Growler as the only tactical aircraft in the Joint Force that ensures electromagnetic spectrum dominance of the battle space, and the continued development of advanced weapons for carriers and their embarked air wings in anticipation of future adversaries, such as the long-range anti-ship missile, and even high-energy lasers, which will help ensure carrier strikers can establish sea control in any environment. The maintenance and modernization of our current aircraft carriers and the ongoing procurement of the new Ford-class ships will ensure our Navy's aircraft carriers and carrier strike groups continue to outpace the threat and bring unparalleled warfighting capability for the combatant commanders. My colleagues at this table and over in the Pentagon understand and are committed to the work that remains to ensure providing these capabilities does not cost the taxpayer a dollar more than they should. The nation's investment in aircraft carriers is significant. Their global reach, their ability to amass firepower over sustained periods, their commanding presence, and proof of our national resolve have routinely demonstrated a high return on these investments. The aircraft carrier, as a centerpiece of a carrier strike group, provides us with an unequaled, hard, soft, and smart power advantage in a single, responsive, flexible, and mobile package, unfettered by geopolitical constraints. No other military capability delivers more. Sir, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you all. We appreciate the great work your staffs do in helping as well. And with that, if there are no other questions, we're adjourned.